Hello and welcome to our inaugural Tech Transformation podcast by Oliver Wight Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Rod Hozack, and for the first time since Oliver Wight, the man, started the business more than 50 years ago, we're going to go back to the future and going to talk tech. With a wealth of experience in melding technology with business processes, I'm excited to face the challenge we're all going to have, and that is, how do we leverage the tools and data we have now and at the same time capitalise on what's coming at us without ending up with an assortment of uncoordinated tools being used to arrive at many different perspectives and along the way losing the value of having one set of plans and one set of numbers. After all, the goal in business should be for everyone to be working to the same destination and using a single set of plans. Otherwise, how do you know what's working and what's not? We want to be with you on this journey, and as we learn, we want to share and help you navigate through this era where tech integration is not just a nice to have, but is going to be essential for maintaining competitiveness and relevance. The conundrum I face every day with clients is that we have wonderful tool sets compared to what I had when I was in industry that unfortunately can become useless unless the foundation data sources are robust. This is not a new problem, but with the breadth of possibilities racing our way with AI and being able to give us answers in nanoseconds, how valuable is that going to be if the inputs are weak? I want to expose you to everyday champions, and I'm interested in that too. So I'm going to be listening intently as we interview these experts. Our mission is to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that will keep you ahead of the game and out of the mire in this dynamic tech environment. We've lined up experts in data and planning systems who are hands-on with information technology. The intent is to give you a practical view of planning and managing planning data right now, but also prepare you for the future. Also, it's not going to be about just the latest bright, shiny objects. We'll explore transformation insights from the last 50 years and peer into the future of tech in business planning. So be prepared to be inspired, be excited, a little scared, as I am, but be well prepared to face the changing tide of technology. Coming up, we have an interview with Darryl Landvater. Darryl is a powerhouse from the early days of MRP, Material Requirements Planning. He co-authored a book with Chris Gray, pioneering book, first published in 1989, called MRP2 Standard Systems, which was so well written and ahead of its time that I still refer to it today. He's worked across a multitude of companies and industries, and more recently has been an integral part of extending distribution requirements planning, DRP, to retail and assortment planning, using a logic called flowcasting to ensure the demand requirements from scan data is the same as what flows back up the supply chain. A simple but powerful concept to ensure supply chain stability.
Hello, Darryl, and welcome to this inaugural episode of Oliver Wight's Tech Transformation podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you with us, and thank you for your time. In this episode, I'll explore with Darryl the vast potential of leveraging your existing technology to prepare for future's challenge, including the next wave of AI. With nearly 50 years associated with Oliver Wight, Darryl's a pro at guiding businesses through significant transformations, boosting planning strategies, and enhancing operational efficiencies. Get ready to discover how your current data and tech can do more. Whether you're wrestling with demand planning systems or trying to optimize your ERP software such as SAP, Darryl has practical, actionable advice that will help propel your company to maximum efficiencies and readiness for what's next. So let's dive in, stay ahead of the tech curve. Welcome, Darryl. Are you ready for the questions?
I'm ready. Go ahead, Rod.
Nowadays, you're spending a lot of time with huge data sets, in particularly the retail environment. What are some of the most complex challenges you've observed in organizations trying to upgrade their technological capabilities? And could you give us some examples of how you've helped companies overcome those challenges?
Sure. First of all, let's talk manufacturing versus retail. So in manufacturing, typically, what do we have? 20,000, 50,000 SKUs, somewhere in that range. And there was a time when that was a challenge. If you go back to the early days of these MRP systems back in the early 1970s, computers could just barely work their way through that. But today, it's not an issue any longer. You could crunch the numbers. Now, there's another aspect of it that has to do with keeping the numbers accurate. But the largest company that I work with in terms of the number of SKUs was General Dynamics Electric Boat. It was the Seawolf nuclear submarine. As you would guess, right? Nuclear submarine's got a lot of parts on it. In this case, it was around 4 million. That was the largest of any of the companies I had dealt with. typically, like I say, it's just, 50,000, 100,000, somewhere in that range. Retail, even a small regional retailer is going to be 3 or 4 million, about the same size data that we'd have to deal with on one of the largest industrial manufacturers in the world. And if you jump up to a big retailer like Walmart is up at 450 million. Now, the question is, how do you deal with that? If you take a system that was designed for 20,000, 30,000, a typical DRP system, for example, that you might use a series of distribution centers, and then you try to use it for 100 million or 400 million SKUs, it doesn't work very well because it wasn't designed for it. It was never designed for the job. You're trying to retrofit it. Now, on the other hand, if you take systems that were designed specifically for those kinds of large data volumes, then it works fine. I ran tests of 450 million SKUs and it ran 2 hours. It was very reasonable, a couple $100 to run. It wasn't expensive at all. You can do it. Now, some of that has to do with the way the software is written. If you look up my name, you'll find a couple of patents. They're expired now because they've been around for so long. 2 of them have to do with the way you process large volumes of data. The other one has to do with slow-moving items, things you don't normally run into in manufacturing. In retail, you have things that sell at a store. They might sell once a month or they might sell once a quarter. You don't typically see that in manufacturing, although you will see it in parts distribution, spare parts distribution, things like that. The data volumes for typical retail were a big problem initially because people tried to take manufacturing systems and apply them, but they're not a problem at all for a system that was appropriately designed. And we've proven that. Now, the whole issue of data accuracy, that's a different subject. And I think I have a question for that at some point, right?
That's coming up next. The take-home message in that one is appropriate systems designed to manage appropriate data. So you've got to know what you want first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's move on to that second question, because this is a chestnut that's been around for a long time. We at Oliver Wight focus on helping companies with processes to guide great decision-making, and we believe that the underlying data is critical. But we see many companies struggle with this. Firstly, just recognizing data integrity as a strategic priority, and secondly, doing anything proactive about it. What advice would you give companies to get a good foundation of data?
We've been beating the data accuracy drum now for over 40 years. If we go back 40 years and you say to me, Darryl, what do you think things are going to be like 40 years from now? I would say everybody's going to have accurate on-hand balances. Everybody's going to have accurate bills of material. Everybody's going to have a master schedule that makes sense. I would have attributed it to that's the stakes, right? That's just the way you would do things in the world we're going to live in. Here we are 40 years later, more than that actually. And everybody is still not everybody. A lot of people are still struggling with this. Now, let's dissect it. Why would they be struggling with this? One view would be, do we know how to do it? We absolutely do. We've proven 40 years ago, these are the steps you take to get accuracy of bills of material. These are the steps you take to get accurate master schedule. These are the steps you take to get accurate routings. These are the steps that you take to have a valid master schedule, just to name a few, right? There's no mystery there. It's tested, it's proven, it's worked a million times. Why do we have this problem right now? The only thing I can say is it all seems to be a function of mindset. Let me give you some examples. This company I work with, they're out in California, and they say, we'll just use inventory accuracy since that's typically a good example. They say to me, we need your advice. There's no way you can get inventory accuracy. And they said, come on in. So I come in and they march me back through the warehouse. There's a garage door in the warehouse area. It's against an outside wall. And outside that wall is a main road. Okay. They bring me out there at 10 in the morning. The garage door goes up. The food truck pulls in right there. Hundreds of people that go flocking through the middle of the warehouse to get something for break. And they look at me with this it's impossible, right? You can't do it. I kind of look at them and I said, well, let me understand something. Doesn't that road go all the way down the side of the plant? And they go, oh yeah, it goes all the way from front to back. And I said, well, and the warehouse is in the back section, but there's a whole front section, isn't there also? Oh yeah, there is. Well, what if you were to create limited access for the warehouse part of it and cut another door in the part that's in the factory, and the food truck can just pull up to that new door instead of the existing door? And they look at me like, oh, God, he's a genius. Well, anybody can figure this out, right? I mean, this is not a difficult problem. they do that and it works fine. But the point is, it didn't take anybody could have solved that problem. It's a mindset. It's impossible. We can't do it. So we're not going to do it. I'll give you another example. This is a company out in Chicago, and they did a lot of work with bars of steel. They have these machines that work on the steel, and then they have these racks that are close by, and they can slide the stuff off of these racks right into the machines because it's pretty heavy stuff. And so they look at me and they go, no way, this could be limited access, right? Because how would you get it out? I mean, it's big, long bars, and you're going to make it turn somewhere and come back, make another turn. I mean, how would you possibly do this? And I said to him, just suppose it, right? Just suppose that we had hanger doors that can slide back and forth. What if we had a lot of these hanger type doors? They can be a chain link. You can see through them. They don't have to be solid walls. You just slide it out of the way, pull the bars you need, do the inventory transaction, slide them back, lock it up again, and boom, we have limited access. And they look at me like, oh, how do you figure that out? You know? And it was so easy. But the point is that when people have a mindset that either you can't do it, or it's going to be a pain, or we have other things that are more important right now, or it's just unappealing. Like, people would love to work on systems and programs and some kind of sophisticated thing. But when you say, let's just do basic stuff and get it accurate, it's kind of uninteresting for some people. Yet it makes a huge difference. It's all a function of mindset, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
And once somebody get the mindset that says, hey, this is really necessary and it's going to be good for us, and we just have to do it, then it's straightforward. You should use approaches that have been tested and proven. There's no sense reinventing the wheel here.
In summary, I'd say it's almost giving people permission to ask the question to be able to solve that problem. Because if they've said it's impossible, no one's asking any questions anymore about how it can be done.
Well, my sense of it is they're looking for a reason that it can't be done, as opposed to looking for a reason to do it.
Yeah.
For all those things I mentioned before. Do we really have to do this? It's going to be a lot of work. If you want to go to the Olympics, guess what? There's a certain amount of drudgery, right? I mean, you have to go out there and train every day. It's a mindset, I think.
Okay. Well, that's a great answer. Moving on, question 3 I've got here. I believe in your early days, you studied under one of the pioneers of AI. Can you give us a view on how AI has evolved from that time and whether the promise back then is being delivered today?
Yeah. The professor of mine at Cornell was Frank Rosenblatt. And Frank invented a thing called the perceptron. And the perceptron is essentially the forerunner, very similar to the neurons in a neural net. In those days, he built it mechanically. He then said, if I'd have been smarter, I'd have just programmed a computer to do it. But that's what they started to do after that. Unfortunately, Frank was out sailing in the Chesapeake Bay one day, got hit in the head with a boom, knocked him unconscious, and he drowned. Then there a whole bunch of naysayers came in that said, oh, that old artificial neuron thing never worked, can't be done. And that was the first of what they call the AI winters. And there were a couple of these things that came along over the years. AI would get pumped up, a lot of enthusiasm, and then get disappointed, and people would shy away from it for a while. But long and short of it is that this idea of an artificial neuron, neural nets, deep neural nets, self-learning, all that all has developed over the years. And so what you're seeing now is you're seeing some really very useful applications of that, right? Like image recognition, natural language processing, all of those types of things. Let's leave large language models out of it for a moment. So now the obvious question is, hey, could we use some of this stuff to better run planning systems? Because that would be pretty appealing. And the short answer is not yet. Let me explain why. The systems that we use for image recognition and natural language processing are active areas of research in artificial intelligence. I'm pretty sure they're going to get solved. But one of them is that you don't know why it did what it did. Okay. There's all these weights in there between these artificial neurons, and this is weighted heavily than another, which is kind of what goes on in your brain, right? The connections, the biological connections between the neurons are either strengthened or weakened and so forth. So it mimics a lot of what happens in a normal brain. But the long and short of all that is that if you say, okay, how'd you get that answer? The answer is, well, there's 3 million of these neurons in there, and the weight between this one and this one was a 0.5, and this one and that one was a 0.7. That doesn't tell you anything. And so if you want people to be accountable, like let's say you're doing demand planning and you say, the AI says, I think it's going to be 100 this week, 110 next week, 120 the week after, and so forth. And you say, Well, ultimately, somebody's going to have to be accountable for this because we're going to buy a whole bunch of stuff or make a whole bunch of stuff. And before I use that, I want to have some idea, how'd you get that? And right now, there's not a good way to do that. Although, as I mentioned, it is an active area of research. And I think that eventually we'll get there. The other limitation in today's neural nets is that it takes a lot of data to be able to train one of these things. They're not very good at the moment in abstraction. Okay. If you think about self-driving car. So if you want to teach a self-driving car not to drive off a cliff, then from what I understand, you have to simulate that probably 1,000 times. Okay. But yet if you take a 15 or 16-year-old and you want to teach them how to drive a car, it takes them like 10 hours and they can learn all the various things. And they don't typically want to drive off a cliff.
Yeah, that's true.
Because they can generalize, right? They can do abstraction. Oh, I know what a wagon is. And, a car is kind of like a wagon. And I know what a cliff is. And I know what happens if I walk off a cliff. And therefore I drove off a cliff, there'd be some big problems there. They can do these kinds of abstractions. Now, if you have something that's pretty static, stop sign. Okay. Stop signs are stop signs. They're not going to change this year to next year to the year after that. Then that works okay. But if you're dealing with something that can change rather frequently, like demand for a product, if we're doing demand planning, or if we're trying to optimize a supply chain in terms of transportation, there's competition that comes in. So there's a lot of things that can alter the situation. And if you need 1 million data points to train the thing, then that's going to be a big problem. But if you develop an AI that has more abstraction capabilities, kind of like what we said before, it knows what a wagon is. It knows what a car, it knows what a cliff is. You don't have to teach it at the pixel level. You can teach it in a more abstract way. Now we can incorporate things like the way a person would do it. They would go, yeah, look at what's happening over here. Look at what's happening over there. The 120 makes sense to me. Okay. And this is why. That would be very valuable. That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of what is likely to happen at some point in the future. But the question I don't know the answer to is when that would happen. Now let's jump to the big, exciting thing at the moment, which is large language models and generative AI. Essentially, oversimplified, but what a large language model is trying to predict the next word. Okay, give me a sequence of words, I'll predict what the next word is. And it's plagued by these hallucinations, right? It makes up stuff. And so somebody said, and I think this is pretty accurate, he said, the thing about large language models and generative AI is everything is a hallucination. It's just some of them are correct. It's not a bad way to look at it. It doesn't mean you can't use it, but it also means that fundamentally, it's just trying to predict the next word. It doesn't really understand what you're talking about in the sense that we would understand something. What people are doing now is they're trying to do some boundaries on AI. So it makes up an answer and then it does some kind of checking to say, is that reasonable or unreasonable? That's very appropriate in my opinion. I don't see as much application for large language models in planning systems. It has a lot of other uses in a lot of other areas. But in terms of a planning system, it's not clear to me that kind of a predictive thing being used, for example, to do demand planning or to do supply chain optimization. But I do think that the deep neural nets that we talked about a minute ago, assuming we get past the amount of data that's required and we get past the ability to understand why it did what it did, those I think would be highly appropriate.
So I guess the key summary of that one is stay tuned, but not yet.
It's certainly something to keep a close eye on.
Okay. Thank you for the next question. For our leaders and future leaders who are watching this program, what practical advice would you offer on preparing for new technologies in a way that aligns with strategic business goals and delivers real value, but doesn't send them broke along the way?
Okay. So as new things come along, some are highly successful, some crash and burn.
Yeah.
The trick is to differentiate which falls in which category. I don't have a hard set of rules to say, check these boxes and it's good, check these boxes and it's bad. But there are some generalizations that we can probably think about. One of the generalizations is with the systems we're dealing with, the planning systems, let's stay within that realm for a moment. Is it a valid representation of reality? Regardless of how we get there, is it valid representation of reality, right? In other words, whether you project it one way or another, if it represents the real world, then that's a good sign. Another one is, how does it work with people? Okay. So in other words, there's a lot of this, AI is going to obsolete all these jobs and we're going to have this massive unemployed workforce. There's no question that if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, it happened slow enough that there was an ability to absorb and retrain and do a lot of other things, right? And if you go back to the Luddites, the Luddites weren't like necessarily anti machinery. They were more like, give us a fair deal here. Okay. You can't just turn us out. I mean, these people would train, 10 years to become a craftsman at something. And then you can hire a 12-year-old and pay them next to nothing. And they do the same job, not as well, but and you would say to these people, it's too bad, figure out how to feed your family, but it ain't going to come from me. So you can understand why there were difficulty and problems as the Industrial Revolution worked its way through the world. The situation with AI could be similar. There could be very rapid change, but most of what we're seeing is not so much that you want to displace people. It's more that you want to give them power tools, for lack of a better term, right?
Yeah.
Now, my wife's a orthopedic surgeon, and so she deals with a lot of situations where somebody cuts her fingers off or, does some other goofy thing with a drill or a saw or something, she's got to patch the thing back up again. So power tools have a lot of advantages because they extend your capabilities, right? But you also have to be careful with them. We're kind of in a similar situation where it's less about replacing people and more about working with people. And how do we, get the equivalent of power tools where they become more effective? Now, will we eventually have robots working in warehouses and those people will be out of a job? Yeah, probably. But even there, it may not be as clean cut as you think. For a lot of the supply chain stuff that we do, I think it's much more going to fall in the category of making people more effective. They're more productive. They make better use of their time. When we first started introducing MRP systems years ago, everybody was big on this idea that there's this big leap in productivity that we get. And so therefore we can lay off a whole bunch of people. We said, I wouldn't do that. If the reward for getting more productive is you lose your job, people are going to find ways to not get more productive.
Yeah.
And what we actually found was that when they got more productive, they ended up doing things that were more effective for their company. Instead of racing around expediting purchase orders, they were working with suppliers with schedules that extended out over the next year or so and working on how can we take cost out? How can we get deliveries up? How can we deal with quality? It was a very cooperative relationship between the groups of people. Those are some guidelines that you can use to predict which ones are going to go down in flames and which ones are likely to survive.
That's a good analogy about reflecting reality and being user-friendly to liberate people to do more, not to reduce the number of people you have.
I'm not saying that there aren't going to be reductions in number of people, but I think it kind of depends on the kind of work we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, that leads to the next question, which is the way things are moving at the moment. I don't even think the experts know what's just around the corner tech-wise, but looking towards the future, what are the next big trends in technology for business planning that companies should be aware of and begin to prepare for now?
Well, the biggest trend, and again, I'm somewhat biased here because I've been working on this for a while. I'm anticipating that these integrated supply chains are going to become very important. And pretty much nobody disputes that an integrated supply chain is better than a bunch of independent companies guessing about what the customer is going to buy from you and so forth. We've been supplying supplier schedules from manufacturers to their suppliers since, 40 some years. John Shore was doing it back in the, late 1970s, early 1980s with great results. But then when we try to go in the other direction, now we're back to that issue we talked about earlier, which is the data volume. So now if we have customers who are parts distributors or into millions of SKUs, very low volume, low movement, or if they're a retailer, we're into that same situation where we're many millions of SKUs. And even in healthcare, if our customers are hospitals or large medical practices, you've got the same kind of thing going. So there were some technical impediments that prevented us from integrating those supply chains. But what we're finding is that when the supply chains are integrated, it really works a lot better. There's now ways that we can do that. The relationships change. If I could use retail manufacturing as one example, there's a lot of old school retailers out there where it's a very adversarial relationship. Beat them with a stick and try to get them down on price and that you're doing your job. But there are others that have a different view. Their view is we ought to work together here. It doesn't mean we can't, have to negotiate on price, and it doesn't mean we can't have to negotiate on some other things, deliveries and so forth. But there's an opportunity for us to improve both our businesses if we work together. And so that's certainly an important part of it. So I think that's one area where I think it's likely to continue to grow over time. And if you think about it, if we have all these different customers and suppliers linked together, then other areas can do as well. So let's say you're a third-party transportation company. I could give you a supplier schedule that says all of these suppliers all these companies that hire you to transport things, here's all their schedules. So now we can sort of work together on that. Similarly, the financial projections, a lot of these companies that have millions and millions of SKUs, it's a lot harder for them to make these financial projections because you have to aggregate all this stuff. A lot of times the systems don't, they're just short-term systems like when should we reorder as opposed to, what's our total plan? What's the expected inventory level? What's the expected purchases we're going to make and so forth. So that becomes a lot more effective too. Now you're working more cooperatively with your financial end of the business. I think there's a lot that can be done in that area. Now, beyond that, I'm not sure. That's kind of where I've been focusing, but I don't have a good sense for what would be other areas that fit in that category.
To summarize, we're not going to be having a natural language chat with a computer and say, optimize my supply chain anytime soon.
I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean, if you look at the history of things, back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a big rush on what was called finite loading, where you would attempt to automatically load things and push orders out and things like that. And it just didn't work because there was no way to hold anybody accountable, and it was making decisions that a person wouldn't have made. Then a couple of years later, it's like the phoenix, it rises from its own ashes. A different version of a similar idea. Okay. And now we've got generative AI, which is, nobody's quite saying it yet, but there is always this desire that I'm going to get a machine that's going to solve all these problems for me. In reality, what we've seen over and over is you can get a machine that makes you more effective, but the machines don't have those kinds of capabilities at this time. Maybe with the advent of general artificial intelligence, you could have something like that. From what I understand, that's a long ways out.
So stay tuned.
Keep up to date. That would be interesting.
Well, that might be a nice segue to the final question. The final question from our client database is, with all the choices of applications out there, how do you choose the right one for you and keep up with the evolution, knowing that what you install today is going to be potentially outdated tomorrow?
Well, everything that you do from a technical point of view will be outdated at some point. But some of these architectures are they last a long time. Okay. We got people working with it. It depends what you call by architectural change. Yeah. So in the old days, we had MRP systems that worked off of big mainframe computers, right? And they're very expensive. The computer cost has gone down dramatically. Okay. If you look at the change from a technical point of view, we had a database that was a spinning disk. Then we had a database, which is a solid state storage. And then we have a database that is in memory. Now, if you're talking about the latency, these planning systems are all about the database. The mathematics is relatively simple for most of them, but generally the database is the thing you worry about the most. You were looking at 30 milliseconds to get something from a database back in the disk days, and then maybe 20 or 10 from a solid state. And then you're looking at nanoseconds to get it from in memory. Would you call that obsoleting the existing hardware? Some people might. I wouldn't. I would say that's kind of the same thing. It's just that some of the parts are faster. The processors are faster and the database is faster. So that doesn't strike me as anything big. Then you have the whole issue of a monolith versus a broken up piece of software. So a monolith is what we used to have, just one giant system. And if you look at places like Google, they're updating stuff a couple times a day. So if you break it up into these microservices, then the idea is that's more suitable to smaller, more frequent changes and a little bit easier to integrate things. So that would be an important improvement. But if you ask me, if I had a decent monolith system and it gave me the answers I was looking for, I'm okay with that. And it's certainly better than a microservices system with bad data in it, right? Yeah, stuff's going to get obsolete, but I don't get too wrapped up in that because you can get a lot of life out of it. Now, if the system that you're about to implement was invented 25 years ago, and maybe it's had a few updates since then, you got to check it out a little more because you don't want something that's hard to maintain, complicated, and has a lot of administrative overhead to it. or unreliable. You don't want that kind of thing. I would say that the planning systems now, I mean, I'm not talking about other types of systems that people have, but the planning systems that we're dealing with can last a while. So there's no rush to go out and immediately replace something.
Unless you're doing everything in spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that would be
But that closes the circle at our earlier conversation that data integrity in the database is actually a critical element of this, not the only thing, but a foundational element.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Darryl, it's been delightful to speak to you again. That's been very insightful for me. Every time I speak with you, I get something new. So thank you for that.
Okay. Well, I was glad to be here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Darryl. We'll talk soon. Bye now. Well, that was great. Always a delight to talk to Darryl. And thanks for tuning into this episode of the Oliver Wight Tech Transformation Podcast. Today, Darryl shed light on how your current technology and data could really direct you and get you ready for the future based on a little bit of his history. A quote from George Santayana always comes to mind. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We explored how integrating your technical aspirations into strategy can lead to a more cohesive planning system. He covered some of the steps for preparing for technology, but it doesn't seem like it's a race to get ready for AI. The underlying data and embedded analytics already in your system are probably something that you can continue to use for quite a while. In our next episode, we'll deep dive into practical strategies for leveraging data with Olga Papageorgiou, who's been in the trenches with data information and decision making. She has a master's in data science strategy and leadership, which means she's more than well placed to give us a clue into what the future of data and tech holds for businesses. So don't miss our next episode, and make sure you subscribe and join us again to keep pushing the boundaries of what is possible in tech transformation. If you'd like to talk to us about how we can help your business with tech transformation, contact us at information@oliverwight.com, or go to our website at www.oliverwhiteasiapacific.com. So let's tech transform with Oliver Wight, navigating today, shaping tomorrow, and giving your career a head start by staying ahead of the tech curve. See you next time. Thanks for joining.